DevOps.com, and welcome to another webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Cloudbees, the Enterprise Jenkins Company. We have a really great webinar lined up today. Pimp your Jenkins platform with Docker, and it's really going to be a very hands-on how-to by Cyril Leclerc, product manager at Cloudbees. We've been lucky enough to have Cyril on other previous webinars, and without a doubt, the feedback we get from when he's doing these is just fantastic. People love the ability to really dive into online demos and see how to do things. Before we start, though, I wanted to just do a couple of polling questions that'll help Cyril in terms of where the audience is with what they know about, what they want to know about. So we're going to ask a short series of questions. I'm going to ask you just quickly to answer, and we'll go from there. So why don't we ask the first question, Jules? So the first one we want to get a sense of is, are you, or how do you view yourself as a dev, an op, or a DevOps? And we'll just give it a few seconds here for everyone to vote, and we'll close voting off in the next 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we've got a lot of people voting, and wow, 71% of you are DevOps, 22% Dev, 7% Ops. Very interesting. Our next question. What's your relationship, if any, with Docker? Well, it could go a lot of different ways, but select one of the following. We are currently adopting Docker, we're evaluating Docker. Or we currently adopted Docker or evaluating Docker. And I suppose if there should have been another one there of not doing anything with Docker, but in any event, we're going to close voting off now. And what do we have? So it looks like, as we see in many polls, about almost 3/4 of you are just evaluating Docker at this point. I don't think that's too much of a surprise. And then let's see our next question if we can. And that is, do you use Jenkins? It is a yes or no. And I'm going to guess that most of you do, as you're here today for the webinar, so it's kind of self-selecting, but it's also probably one of the most popular tools. So 86% of you use Jenkins, and thank you for answering that. And do we have one more question here? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, do you use a cloud platform for production workloads? And if so, which cloud platform do you use? And if you can answer this, surprised to see. All right, we'll close voting in the next 5, 4. Closed. What are our answers? Wow, other actually beat out AWS, Cyril. I don't know if you were expecting that. Okay, and our next question. Do you use a Docker orchestration service? And we have Swarm, Kubernetes, Mesos, or AWS ECS. And again, if we can vote here, and I know many of you who are just evaluating Docker may not be using anything, so we'll close voting in the next 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And for those of you who are using a Docker orchestration service, it looks like Swarm narrowly beats out Kubernetes and AWS, which was tied with Kubernetes. Very interesting. And then I think we might have one more question, correct? Or is that it? No, that was it. Okay. With our polling out of the way, we're going to get into the meat of our webinar now, and hopefully your answers will help Cyril. As I mentioned, our guest today is Sorel Leclerc, Product Manager, Cloudbees. And Sorel, would you like to take it away?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, according to where you are located. For me, it's evening. I'm based in Europe. So today, we are going to talk about Jenkins on Docker. First, let me introduce myself. I am a product manager at Cloudbees. I am in charge of alliances I cover many Docker topics at Cloudbees. I used to be a dev person, I evolved progressively to DevOps. I embraced DevOps. I have done 15 years of consulting before joining Cloudbees. I do open source contribution when I have time, and it's mostly in Java. And it's a project called JMX which is to do monitoring of Java application. So about you, what we have discovered today is that you are mostly DevOps person and also dev person, some ops also in the group. Most of you are evaluating Docker, some of them, but good number already have adopted Docker. You are familiar with Jenkins, maybe not as much with Cloudbees, so I will also give you a quick overview. People use AWS, Azure, on other platforms. And regarding the Docker orchestration service, we've seen that Swarm is strong, and Kubernetes and AWS were also quite strong. Now, a quick presentation on Cloudbees, my company. So, for those who don't know Cloudbees, Kosuke Kawagashi is the creator and founder of Jenkins, which was called Hudson at the beginning, and is our Chief Technical Officer. We are the enterprise Jenkins company, so we used to say that we are to Jenkins what Red Hat is to Linux, and we provide enterprise solutions for Jenkins. This solution can be as a service, and they can also be as a software. So you have the name Cloud in our name, but we also provide our solution as a software. Jenkins with Docker. So Docker is very important in Jenkins and in continuous integration and continuous delivery platform, as it is important in all the places of data centers. And here, what we will see is that Docker is very important on a continuous delivery platform because it will change the way you manage your build servers. So the servers where you build your applications, on Docker has a key role in this landscape. It can really simplify the way you as a CD administrator will manage your platform. And we will also cover another aspect which is key, is how you can extend your existing continuous delivery pipeline CI builds to ship your application, package your application as Docker containers so that they can be run on production as Docker containers. So in the past we used to ship Java applications like WAR file, Ruby application, PHP applications, Python applications like archives, and deploy them on servers. And now we have a new opportunity, which is to ship our application as Dockerized, as Docker image, Docker containers. And we will see today how you can do it with Jenkins, how you can extend your existing CI jobs to do it. And we will also see the role of the Docker registry. It can be Docker Hub or it can be your private Docker registry. What role it will play in this pipeline and in this infrastructure. So Jenkins with Docker, two key aspects. One is to Dockerize your Jenkins infrastructure. It will help you to customize the build servers with Docker containers. Some of you have to install specific compilers or tools. People with Ruby have to install a special version of Ruby sometime, or it can be the same with Python. Some people have to install tools for web browser tests, like Selenium with a given version of Firefox or of Chrome. And all this can be really simplified using Docker images on Docker containers. Another value of Dockerizing your Jenkins infrastructure is to be able to have a clean build environment with ephemeral container. If you build your application in an ephemeral Docker container, then at the end of the build, the container will be destroyed, and the next build will start on a clean new container. So even if one build installs some weird things on your platform, it will be cleaned up, and so your environment will always be reproducible. This was the first part, Dockerized Jenkins infrastructure. And the second key thing is continuous delivery pipeline for Dockerized application. How do I package my application as a Docker containers? We will cover both of them today. First, I will do a quick review of the existing Docker plugins in Jenkins. So there are many Docker plugins in Jenkins. I will give a quick overview, and then I will pick some of these plugins and I will do a demo. One of the key plugins is called the Docker plugin. It does two types of things. First, it is a slave provider, so in the sense that you can provision slaves as provision Docker containers as build slaves. On the other set of features provided by this Docker plugin is to allow you to do all your Docker commands in build steps of your jobs. And here you can do something like build unpublished Docker images. All this is available in your jobs with the Docker plugin, and it has been created in November 2014, so it's 1 year old. If we come back to this screen, you can see a standard configuration for slave provided by your Docker infrastructure. First, you configure your Docker orchestration service. So here it's a Docker host with Mesos, Kubernetes, Amazon ECS. It will be slightly different, but it's the same idea. And then you create Docker slave profiles, slave templates based on Docker images, and you will assign some labels, Jenkins labels, to these images, to these templates, so that you can manage different flavors of slaves on your environment. Let's review now another plugin. This plugin is a Docker custom build environment plugin. The feature set is focused on how to run build steps in a Docker container. So this plugin does not cover the Dockerized Elastic slaves, but here in your build definition, you will be able to say that you want the steps of your build to run in a Docker image. It can be a Docker image pulled from the Docker registry, your Docker registry, Docker Hub, or your private registry, or you can bring your own Docker file with your job. This plugin requires to run a Docker daemon on your slave, so typically it works with a Linux slave, and it is more younger than the Docker plugin because it has been introduced in June 2015. There is a lot of adoption as well, and it is heavily maintained. Another plugin is called the Docker Workflow plugin. So here it's very similar to the Docker Custom Build Environment plugin, but it covers Jenkins workflow. So some of you may be familiar with Jenkins workflow, and I hope that you have discovered this feature, which is very interesting in Jenkins. It's the ability to define your job with a Groovy DSL. And here in this Groovy DSL, with the Docker Workflow plugin, you can invoke Docker commands And here you can see that you can run a shell step in a Docker container with this docker.image.inside command. Or you can also do other things like building a Docker image on your build. Here you can see the second code fragment with docker.build, where I build my Docker image, and I push it, and you could see with registry statement that I have declared the credentials to upload this to my Docker registry. Here it will be the Docker Hub. So this plugin is quite similar to the Docker custom build environment plugin. It applies to Jenkins workflow, and it also requires to run a Docker daemon on your slave, and it was introduced in June 2015. Another plugin is called the Docker Build and Publish plugin. And here it focused on building and pushing your Docker images to a registry. Another one is a Docker Hub notification plugin. So it allows you to trigger your build when a new image has been pushed to the Docker registry. It's called Docker Hub for the moment, but a pull request is ongoing to also support Docker private registry with the V2 API format. So soon it will be able to support notification for private registries as well. And this is key if you want to trigger your build when a change has been done in a Docker registry. There are some other Jenkins Docker plugins, like the Docker traceability plugins, which will extend Jenkins traceability mechanism to Docker images built on your slaves in your builds. Another one is a Docker build step plugin, which helps you to execute Docker commands in build steps, so you will have build, push, and so on. Another set of Jenkins plugins related to Docker are the Cloud Slave providers. So Cloud Slave providers is a mechanism in Jenkins to create slaves on demand. Maybe you have seen the Amazon EC2 plugin that helps to create slave based on Amazon VMs on demand. You have the equivalent with Azure, you have the equivalent with OpenStack, or you have the JCloud plugin. And we find similar plugins that work with the key Docker orchestration service. So we will find a Kubernetes plugin, which is a slave provider. Similar configuration to what we have seen at the beginning with the Docker plugin. You give the URL of your orchestration service. So here it's a Kubernetes URL, credentials, to connect to this. Oh, sorry, my mouse is, oops, sorry. Tricky. So you give the configuration details to access to Kubernetes, and then you will define templates of images of slaves, where you pick a Docker image and you assign Jenkins labels to these images so that you can you can use them in jobs. So this is a Kubernetes plugin. We have a similar one, which is a Mesos plugin. So here it works with Mesos. Mesos is slightly more sophisticated and more complex than Kubernetes, because Mesos not only supports Docker but also other container technologies. So the configuration may be a bit more complex to learn and to set up at the beginning. Then you have the Amazon EC2 Container Service plugin. So here it's a very standard configuration. You can see in the first screenshot how you configure how to access to Amazon EC2 Container Service with where you select your ECS cluster, and then you have slave templates with labels, and you associate with Docker images. So this is your Docker image in Docker Hub or your private registry, and then you define the size of your slave with memory and CPU, and you have advanced configuration as well if needed. So this was a review of many of the most important Docker-related plugins in Jenkins. Today, in our demo, I will focus on a sample which is based on an environment on Amazon AWS for my demo. And here, I will use a Jenkins master, which will be an EC2 VM. I will use an EC2 slave, which is a Linux slave on which I will install a Docker daemon. And I will use the Jenkins Docker custom build environment plugin on the Docker workflow plugin. And I will also show you how Jenkins can work with the Amazon EC2 container service to create slaves on demand. I will build an application. I will take the source code. It will be a Java application. I will take the source code from GitHub. It's a Maven application. I will build it the way we used to build Maven application on Jenkins. It will be very familiar to you, probably. And then I will create a Docker image of this application. So I will Dockerize my web application, my Java application. I will deploy this Docker image to the Docker Hub registry, and then I will deploy the application on Amazon ECS Elastic Container Service. So this will be my demo. Do you have any question? Please don't hesitate. Oops. So now, yes, this is what I wanted. So web application, you can see it's on gameoflife-ecs.bishop.org. This is a web application. Game of Life is a demo application created by the authors of the books Jenkins The Definitive Guide. We have done a fork of this application to customize 2-3 things, but you will see it's exactly the same. So if you are familiar with this book, Jenkins The Definitive Guide, you will be familiar with this. And here I can customize my application. Next to it, I have my Jenkins server. So here it's Cloudbees Jenkins Enterprise, which is Cloudbees solution around Jenkins. It's our Cloudbees Jenkins platform. Most of the features that I will show you today are available in Jenkins open source. Some of them are available as part of Cloudbees Jenkins platform, and I will tell you when it's the case. So it's a standard Jenkins. On my source code will be hosted on GitHub, on its Game of Life, as you can see here. So it's a standard Maven application. You can see pom.xml. I will have to build this, and then I will run acceptance tests, which are Selenium web browser tests. If I come back to my sample, here my EC2 slave is a standard Linux slave. There is just Ubuntu, OpenJDK, and a Docker daemon. I did not install build tools like Selenium, like JMeter, and so on. All this will be provided by my Docker containers for my pipeline. On the Jenkins master is to build it, I used Cloudbees image on AWS Marketplace. So if we look at the AWS Marketplace, you can find it. You just have to search, and this is what I installed. So if you launch this, you can install the same server as I did. So let's come back to our sample. I have my source code repository, my Jenkins master. I will first do a demo with the EC2 slave, and I will push this to Amazon ECS. I push it to Amazon ECS, but the concept would be very similar to push an application on Kubernetes or on Swarm and so on. My Jenkins configuration. So I will use a freestyle job. I configure my GitHub project, which is very standard for you, I hope. My GitHub URL. And here you can see Maven clean package. So this is a standard way to build. But now what I will do is I will use the Docker custom build environment plugin to check the box build inside the Docker container in your build environment section of your job. And I say that I will build on a Docker image that Cloudbees is maintaining. Let's look at it. Oops, sorry. On here, no. You can see, no, I have my private access to Cloudbees repository, but we maintain an image called Java Build Tools, where we install many tools to build application. For example, so we take Ubuntu 15.04, we build we add unzip, wget, curl, git, make. The version is 4.0, GCC is 4.9.2, OpenJDK, Maven 3.3, XVFB for web browser test, Firefox, so it will be Firefox 42, Selenium, it will be 2.48.2, AWS CLI, it will be the latest, so it's version 196, Azure CLI, Cloud Foundry CLI, OpenShift v3 CLI, JMeter 2.13, Kubernetes CLI, MySQL client. So we have prepared a bunch of tools that may be convenient, and if you want, you can easily fork or copy-paste fragment of this image to create your own Docker file with only the bits that you like. This is an open source file, so you can very easily extract the pieces that are convenient to you or extend this image if you want. So this is the way I set up my build environment. And I told you that on this Jenkins slave, I don't have Firefox installed, I don't have the AWS CLI installed. On here, thanks to this Docker container, all this will be available. I will also use another feature, which is called the AWS CLI plugin. It's a Cloudbees specific plugin where we inject the credentials of your AWS account that you manage in Jenkins Credential Store. And it's configured for you, AWS CLI is installed for you, and you can use it as a shell step. So this is how I use the Jenkins Docker Custom Build Environment plugin. I can run it. And let's look at what the previous build was. Very verbose. Yeah, please. Oh. So here you can see that here there is a Docker exec. So my build steps are executed in a Docker container. And you will see in the job that I have Firefox version 42. I have the AWS CLI that has been installed, and I can do an EC2 describe instances. So here my AWS CLI is configured, and it will be important to deploy on ECS. And then you could see that I have my Maven step that is executed, so Maven clean package, and everything works. So this is how we use the Jenkins Docker Custom Build Environment plugin. You mostly have to check this box in your job definition and to define the Docker image that you want to use. And if you store it on Docker Hub, it's convenient because you don't have an extra configuration setup setting up a Docker registry. You can also inject credentials if it's a private image and so on. So this was a demo with the Docker Custom Build Environment plugin. Now I will show you a much more complex demo with Docker workflow. So what will be more complex? I have just showed here with for the moment with my first sample how to use Maven to package, and also I showed you that Firefox was existing. Now I will continue to work on my EC2 slave, and I will also build the Docker image, and I will deploy the Docker image On Docker Hub, I will restart my Elastic Container Service application with my new image, and I will run Maven Selenium test. So there will be Selenium test using Firefox triggered by Maven. Here we may do a quick overview of our Amazon ECS configuration. So if you are familiar with this, you can select EC2 container service. I use standard clusters, the default cluster. And here you can see that I have one task definition, which is called Game of Life, another Jenkins slave. It's for the second part of my demo. So this is my Game of Life task definition. And if I look at the service, so service on Amazon ECS, Elastic Container Service, is a long-running Docker task. So this is my service, and this is, please believe me, the Game of Life web application that we could see here. And here you can see that it was built by the Game of Life workflow job number 25. So let's look at my workflow job to see how I configure this. So some of you may not be familiar with Jenkins workflow, so I will spend some time with you on this. So here in Jenkins workflow, I will start with the simple bits. You can see that on line 7, I get the source code from Git. Here I don't put credentials, but it's a very standard syntax to access Git. And I could have used the snippet generator to define this syntax. So I get the URL here. In the snippet generator, I select Git. And here you can see the standard configuration screen that you are used to use to configure Git. And you can generate the snippet that you can copy-paste. This snippet generator helps to write your workflow job copy-pasting fragments. It's good to learn. So here I do my Git checkout, Git clone. Then I do my Maven step, so MVN clean package. There is a small optimization with this settings.xml file. It's a small optimization that I could detail later. And as we said, we want to run this Maven build inside a Docker image. And here you can see on line 6 that I use a docker.image command, .inside. So it was a syntax that I introduced in the Docker workflow slide. On the steps that are inside my Docker image inside statement will be executed in this Docker container. So here the Git checkout on the Maven clean package will be executed in this Docker image Java build tools 005. Then I will build my image as I will Dockerize my image. So in my application, in the source code of my application, I package a Docker file as well. So this is what the kind of things that you will have to do if you want to Dockerize an existing Java, PHP, Python, Ruby application, or who knows Go. So I will show you. Let's come back to the source code. No, this is not the source code that I wanted. It's, sorry, here. So this is my Game of Life fork. And if you look at the Game of Life web module, I have created a Docker file. And in this Docker, let me zoom, I will say that my Docker file will be an extension of the official Tomcat 8 image. And I will add to this Tomcat 8 image my Game of Life war file, and I will name it root.war, so it will be deployed at the root of my Tomcat context. So this is my Docker file. It allowed me to deploy my application in the root context of my Tomcat server. And now let's come back to this workflow fragment. So once I have built the war file with this Maven clean package, I will do my Docker build. Docker build command that you can see line 15 takes as the first parameter the name of my image, so C. Leclerc Game of Life. This is the name of my Docker Hub image. So let's come back to Docker Hub, if you can see my screen. And you can see that I have a public repository called Game of Life. So C. Leclerc Game of Life here is what you see in my workflow here. And then in which folder is located my Docker file, and it's in Docker file Game of Life web. Once my Docker image is built, I will push it to the Docker Hub registry with this Docker push here. And to push to Docker Hub, I have to define credentials. And for these credentials, what I have done is that I have defined my credentials for my whole workflow script. So here with this line 1 docker.withRegistry, I have injected my Docker Hub credentials. Let me show you what is this identifier. If you look at the credential store in Jenkins, I have defined these up.docker.com credentials, and you can see that the ID of these credentials is Docker Hub credentials C. Leclerc, or we can see it here in the advanced panel. It's read-only now. So this is the identifier that I have used in my with registry statement. If you don't manually write it, define it, then it will be a random value. So I could do my git push by, sorry, not git push, but Docker push with these credentials. Once the image is pushed on Docker Hub, I will redeploy my ECS service. So if you remember, the ECS service is the service here, Game of Life, that is active with one desired container running. I did it. The way I restart in my container is to set desired count to 0 and then to 1 with sleeping a bit. So there may be other ways to deploy. It will depend on the procedures that you like to adopt on ECS. Once my application is restarted, I will start some browser tests. And here I will show you other Jenkins workflow features, is that I will send an email to a group of recipients with this message: do you want to start the web browser test? And here you can see this mail command that is should be familiar to people who use mail notifications in Jenkins, because it is simply this configuration. And with the snippet generator, you can see this mail statement that has been generated, and that helped me. So I will send an email to myself asking, do you want to start? Then I created an input step in my workflow. So here I wanted to show you how to interrupt a workflow and wait for a human interaction, a human validation. This validation can be secured by security groups, by roles in Jenkins, if you want. And then I will start my Selenium test. Web browser tests are a bit fragile, so I will use a retry clause. So I will try up to 3 times to run this test. And they will also run in the Java build tool containers that contains Firefox and Selenium. And here I will run the Game of Life project that is called Game of Life Acceptance Test. It's Selenium with 2CD, which is a web browser testing framework based on Selenium. And you can see that I specify the URL of my test server with parameters. So this is my workflow definition. Let's run it now. And while it's running, I will show you some steps. So here you can see this is the Cloudbees workflow stage view. So this is not in Jenkins open source, it's just in Jenkins Cloudbees Jenkins platform, this piece. I told you I would give you details on this. And you can see details of what has happened. So here my application has been built. So if you remember, this was defined by the stage step. So build web app, it has been done, and it has run in a container. Then build and push Docker image. It took 9 seconds. So this is this step, line 12, build and push Docker image. So I have done a Docker build and a Docker push. Let's come back. And then we have this redeploy ECS service. This one is quite long because I have invoked sleep 60 seconds and then 20 seconds to give the time to restart. There are probably more sophisticated way to do it, but for this demo it was convenient. And here you can see that I have used a BillDropper to inject the credentials on the configuration of my AWS CLI. So I will show you with the snippet generator. You select wrap, and here you have all the plugins that support BillDropper, and there is only one, which is a AWS CLI command. And I can select my AWS credentials, the default region in which my AWS CLI will be configured, and I can generate a Groovy script with this wrap command. So this is how I have integrated my workflow script, my pipeline with AWS ECS. Let's come back to, oops, sorry, it was here. So it has been redeployed, and here you can see that this is paused. Paused because there is this input statement. So let me look at my email, and you can see here that I have received an email from Jenkins telling me start web browser test, game of life. Let's come back to my build execution. So game of life workflow, you can see that here the job is paused. If I, on the Cloudbees stage view, I can have this button proceed on the board. These values can be customized in the workflow definition. I will show you another way to see it. If you look at the logs of your job, you can see here that the workflow is interrupted on this input statement with always my text, start web browser test on game of life, proceed abort. On the last way to see it is with this pause for input. Sorry, I have to find it. Pause for input here. And here you can see that your job is paused for input and that you can proceed on abort. I will show you with the console. So I decide to proceed. And here you can see that it is executing the next step of my job. And it is running the web test, the Firefox Selenium test. And this is my build number 26. So if you remember, in this console, in this web page, I can see the build number. So if you look at the lower right corner, it's written 25. So if I refresh this page, it will be 26. I will wait for the web browser test to finish, because if I remember, the web test is a bit fragile. So here the test has been successful. These were Firefox tests. I have not installed Firefox on my Linux slave. It was provided by the Docker image. So now let's refresh the application. And here you can see it's 26. So what we have seen, and let's come back to the slide, is that I could take code from GitHub. On a Linux slave, I could build my game of life application. Then I package it as a Docker image, bundling Tomcat and game of life. I push this image to Docker Hub. I deployed this application on Amazon ECS, EC2 Container Service. It could also have been Kubernetes, Mesos, or a standard raw Docker or Swarm. It would be the same. And once my application has been redeployed, I did some automated web browser test with Selenium on Firefox. Selenium and Firefox were not installed on this slave, so I could have different project team testing with different version of Firefox. They would just have to use different Docker images. This was my demo. Now I will do a quick other demo, which is I will use ECS, Elastic Container Service, to provide slaves. So I have to hurry. So I have installed the Amazon EC2 Container Service plugin. And here you can see that I have configured my Jenkins to use ECS Cloud plugin. I will use the default cluster of ECS, and I have two templates of slave, one based on the Cloudbees JNLP slave with Java build tools, and the other one with the Docker image, the official Jenkins CI JNLP slave. I specified the quantity of memory on the CPU unit, and I created a job which defines with the label that it wants to run on the Docker image with Java build tools, and it will just do Firefox version on Java version. So I will run this image, I will run this job, sorry, and I will see that it will run. Oh, it takes a bit of time to start. Let's look at ECS now. You can see here that there is a Jenkins slave 1143 task that has been started. It is running, so it will soon finish. So this, here I can see in ECS console that Jenkins is using a slave provided by ECS. So let me come back. Sorry, let me come back here. Okay, and the slave the job has run. Let me show you the name of the slave. Here it was a random name. It has been used, and now it will be recycled, terminated by Jenkins. And if I look at my execution, you can see the name of the slave, which has been created by this cloud provider, and that I have Firefox 42 on all the build tools that I like. So here I could show you how to set up a continuous delivery pipeline to Dockerize your Java application or your web application or the application that you use to build on Jenkins, integrated with Docker Hub, customizing the build environment with the Docker workflow plugin or the Jenkins custom build environment, Docker custom build environment plugin. I also demoed Elastic slaves created on demand. I did this demo with Amazon EC2 Container Service. It could have been done with the Docker plugin with standard Docker or Swarm servers, or it could have been done with Kubernetes or with Mesos. So to summarize, Jenkins workflow to define a CD pipeline, Jenkins Docker workflow to customize the build environment. I used Selenium, Firefox, if you remember, on Maven 333. I also use Docker workflow to build and push Docker images. I use a Docker registry, which was Docker Hub, to manage my Docker images. I use Amazon EC2 Container Service to run my Dockerized Java application that has been deployed automatically by Jenkins. On my last demo was to use Amazon EC2 Container Service to run slaves. Here are the resources to find more, to learn more about Jenkins on Docker, and we will publish this slide deck. I will come back to a quick thing. Here we may have some question. Is it better to take standard Linux slaves and to install a Docker daemon on it to use Docker workflow, Docker custom build environment, or is it better to use dynamic Docker slaves with the Docker plugin on a Swarm, or maybe a remote Docker host, or maybe with Kubernetes. Personally, I like a lot to just install a Docker daemon on a Linux slave to learn and discover the flexibility of what can be done with Docker on a Jenkins environment. And I think also it's a very iterative approach. It's an iterative approach. You start with a small change, which is just to install the daemon, and then you move forward. And later you can adopt a Docker orchestration service like Swarm, Kubernetes, Mesos, or a cloud solution like ECS. Thank you very much. It's time for the questions, please.
Yes, it is. Cyril, before we even get to questions, though, I want to thank you. Your webinars are always tops in my book.
Thank you.
They're just great webinars. So thank you so much for that. Let's get to some questions though, because we don't have a lot of time. Our first question. Well, a lot of people seem to have this sort of thing. Can you try to answer why to use Dockers and containers with Jenkins? Like, what are the advantages, if you will?
So really what I like with, I like to Dockerize my Jenkins infrastructure because it helps me to customize the build servers with Docker containers. Instead of having to maintain 5 or 10 types of Linux slaves to have the right version of Firefox for the web team, or to have the right version of Firefox for the accounting team that would use a different version of Firefox for its automated test and so on. Here I can really simplify my build slaves. They are just Linux with Docker daemon, and each team can choose which build tool they install on it. If you think about Ruby teams, it's more convenient to install Ruby or PHP or Python directly on the host, and to not have to manage things like RVM to pick the right version. Each team will select exactly the tools that they want. Some people want ImageMagick, and you have to be root to install this. If you want GCC, the compiler, you may also have to be root to install. When I use Dockerized slaves, I can simplify my jobs, my slaves, and it is the project team that will come with its own Docker image. And the other benefit is that I can clean up my build environment between each job.
Very good. Next question, Cyril, is can we compare and contrast Docker with Nexus?
I would say that Nexus is Nexus is the Sonatype Nexus is a Maven repository. So it's a place where you store your image, your artifacts, your Java artifacts, or your application binaries. When you use Dockerized environment, then the artifact is no longer a WAR file, but it's a Docker image. So you need to use Docker Hub or another Docker registry, such as JFrog Artifactory, or maybe a Docker Trusted Registry to store these images. But then Docker is the execution container of your application, which Nexus is not. Nexus is my repository, and when I work in a Dockerized environment, I continue to have my repository of Java artifacts, like I have my repository of Debian package or RPM to install my Linux stuff. I continue to have my Java artifact repository with Nexus, and I introduce a new artifact repository, which is the Docker registry.
Okay, our next question is, Jenkins seems to be running in one server and Docker is running in another server. Can we build Docker image on remote server?
Yes, we can. There are some things which are a bit more complex because you usually want to have the workspace of your job running on the same host as your Docker daemon. So it's possible. There are some things that are possible. There are some things that are not possible.
Excellent. Next question is, what was the AMI for Jenkins that you showed?
Okay, so here the AMI for Jenkins that I showed is, if you do a launch, you go to AWS Marketplace, and here you do Cloudbees. You search for Cloudbees, and you will find the Cloudbees Jenkins Enterprise. So it's an AMI that is published on the AWS Marketplace. So it's a way to access it. And then I could provide the AMI used for the slave. I will provide it as a comment. It's an AMI that it's a build slave that Cloudbees works on, and we want to publish very soon this AMI in our documentation. It's just a JDK with Ubuntu and with a Docker daemon.
Okay, very good, thank you. Our next, it's not really a question, it's a request, Cyril. After the presentation, can you make the configuration of the jobs readable for anonymous users?
Configuration of this job, okay. Otherwise, it's on, I have a gist. I think it will be easier. I think it's this one. And I can share this with everybody in the chat window, maybe? I've shared it on the chat window. Is it accessible to everybody, or is it more complex?
It's just to organizers. We will, can we cut and paste that, and I'm going to put it in handouts to everyone here.
How can I say to everybody?
Chat, right, hit it, under 2, just hit entire.
Julie is doing it.
We took care of it. Yes, Jules took care of it. Thank you, Jules. So in your chat window, everyone, you can see that. Next question. Cyril, how are the build results of what is running in the container collected by Jenkins?
That's a good question. So here it depends on the implementation of how the build is connected. It's a very technical question. I think we will understand if we look at the console logs, because here you can see the way the Docker run is with cat. No, I don't know, because cat is not the answer. I would have to deep dive in the code. I contributed a bit to this code, but not to this very technical stuff. I'm sorry.
Okay. Someone just asked, is Docker open source or is it a paid service? I can answer that. Docker, the container Docker is open source. They do have paid services such as Swarm and some of the others. And they
have support as well.
Yeah. Another question. Does it have to be a JNLP or can it be SSH connection for the slaves?
So here it will depend on each plugin that integrates with Jenkins. Sorry, let me find my slide. So when I use a Linux slave with a Docker daemon, with Docker workflow, Docker custom build environment, here you choose the technology that you want, and I was using SSH. When it's a Docker container that is your slave, usually we will see that they use JNLP, because then it's a Docker container slave that connects to the master. This is the reason why it's JNLP, and you will see that it is JNLP, not for the JNLP protocol, but to have the connection opened by the slave, and you will see it for Mesos, for Kubernetes, for Amazon ECS, for example.
Excellent. Cyril, unfortunately, we're 2 minutes past the hour, and we have to be mindful of people's times. We do have many other questions.
I have all my time. I'm sorry I took too much time to...
No, don't be sorry. Cyril, with the amount of questions we've had, we would have to do this for 2 hours. So not to worry. We do have these questions in writing, though. Jules will collect them. We will send them to you, Cyril. If you can give written answers. We'll post them on the website along with the recording of today's webinar. You know, it's a sign of an excellent webinar that we had this many questions, so please don't be sorry. But we're going to have to, we're going to have to call it a wrap for today, though. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will try to have Sorel back soon in another webinar because they're always some of the best we do. Thank you to Cloudbees for sponsoring today's webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sorel. We will see you at the next DevOps.com webinar. Until then, this is Alan Schimmel of DevOps.com. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, DevOps.com, and thank you to Alan and to Jules.
Thank you, Sorel. Be well. Bye-bye.
Bye.